Hello. So in this video, I'm going to explain what is CSS selector. So what are the different ways we can select the HTML tag where we want to apply our style. Okay. So the CSS selector are used to target or pick a HTML element where we want to change the style. Okay. On what element we want to change the style. So that is called selector. As I have explained in the previous video, you will specify the selector here in your style declaration, whether it is inline or external. You will specify the selector here where you want to apply what element you want to change, what element you want to apply the style. Okay, that is called selectors. So there are different ways of selector. There are different ways that you can apply or specify the selectors. So HTML element selector, that's what we have. We have explained in the previous, or you want to change the paragraph, style of the paragraph, style of the H1, like that. You can simply specify, like given in this example, you're saying that P means paragraph. Like that, you're using the HTML element name as a selector. So that is the first type. Using the HTML name itself as a selector. So the second type of selector is called class selector. And there is a third type called ID selector, and fourth type descendant selector. So we'll see one by one. Okay. So first, since you are already familiar with this HTML element selector, that is just specifying the name of the element. You should be comfortable with this. So let's move on to this second type, that is class selector. So what is class selector? So class selector can apply CSS rule to more than one element. That means you can simply say a class, you can create a class and you can integrate that class to different tags. Okay, I will explain that. So you can apply the CSS rule to more than one element using the class. Okay, so let me explain it with syntax. Here you can look at this. This is how we will use class selector. So where you have to use the keyword class. So you have to specify the keyword which is going to be the attribute of any tag. Okay. So inside the particular tag, you have to specify the keyword class. As a value of the keyword, you have to pick a name for the class. Okay, so you're going to apply the rule by using this name only. Okay, so you have to pick a name. Here I have specified the name of this particular class is going to be new. Okay, so in our CSS, you will say for example, you can recall this. This is an internal CSS where you will specify the style in the head tag. Okay, so inside the CSS, instead of specifying P or H1, you are saying new, that is the class name. Okay, so when you specify the class name, you have to use the dot. You have to use the dot. So when a browser see dot, then it will just translate it as a thing like it is a class. Okay, whenever the browser see dot in CSS, then it will understand that this is a class. Okay, and the class name is going to be new. So wherever you are tagging this class new, in whichever element you're tagging, there and all, this style will get applied. Okay, I'll explain it clearly. For example, you want to change the font color. So you have understood the color is the keyword that you have to use to change the font color, right? And here you want to apply the font color on H1, H2, and then on footer. Okay, so you want to apply this on. So if in all this, so if you are going to apply it by using the first selector, that is on HTML element selector, then what you will do, you have to just go and specify it separately with each selector like this. In H1 I want to change the color, H2 I want to change the color, in footer I want to change the color. But if you use this class type selector, then what you will do, you will just create a selector like class. You will just create a class and the class name is going to be color. Okay, so the color is the font name. And then you will attach it with the particular element. Okay, and then in your style declaration, all you are going to do is, instead of specifying it on separately with each element, you will simply say the class, that is dot means class, right? So the class color is going to have the color value of red. Okay, so single declaration. So the selector is, this is the selector, right? Instead of specifying the selector h1, h2 footer, you're specifying that as a class selector. So this type of selectors are called class selector. You can simply attach this. You can simply embed it on the element where you want to apply. So you're simply going to say that you're going to apply this class on this particular element. So this type of selector is called class selector. Okay, so next we'll see what is ID selector. So next type of selector that we are going to see is ID selector. Okay, so what is the difference between this class selector and then ID selector? So in the previous example when I explained, ID selector can be applied on different elements, right? Different tags. You can apply the ID element on different tags, like in the previous example I have explained, you can apply it on h1, h2 or footer, like that. You can apply the class selector on different element. So that is not possible with the ID selector. You cannot apply a style on different IDs. You cannot specify a particular style. If you say that the font color is going to be red on header, then you cannot apply it on the footer. Okay, so if you use ID, you cannot use as the same. You cannot use the same style on different element. That is one restriction that ID have. Okay, and similarly, the ID, two elements cannot share the same ID, and one element cannot have two IDs. That means H1 cannot have one ID that explains you should have red color, and another ID that explains that you should have background color of yellow or something. So that is not possible. One element cannot have two IDs. But in class it is possible, but in ID it is not possible. So ID has these kind of restrictions. Okay, so now we'll see what is the syntax to use ID. So like how in class selector the keyword that we use is class, similarly for ID selector we have to use the keyword ID. Okay, and then as usual, here inside this ID name you can just specify any name that you want to specify, that is the ID name. And similarly, how we have done it in the class selector, inside the style you have to use this ID name, but here instead of dot, for ID you have to use hash symbol. Okay, so if the browser sees dot new, then it will say the new is the class name, means it will say, or it will understand, oh, it is a class selector. Whenever a browser see the hash symbol, then it will understand this is a ID selector. Then it will apply all the rules that is associated with the ID, like two elements cannot have the same ID and one element cannot have two ID. Like those kind of rules will be applicable when a browser see a selector as an ID selector. Okay, so apart from this, the syntax is same. Okay, so let me explain it in the once again here. Okay, so for example, here you are saying that you want to apply the H1, the heading H1 only should have a ID, that the color value. Okay, the ID name is going to be let's say the same color is going to be color 1, or font color, say font color is the ID name. Okay, H1 ID font color. Okay, this is the ID and we want to apply it on H1. Okay, so in style inside, so if you are doing it as a inlines or internal style, then what you will do in your style sheet, you will specify the ID means hash symbol and the ID name is font color, and what you are going to say, the color is going to be green only for heading. Okay, so the color is the keyword that you will use to change the font color, and since green is the primary color, you can simply say green, so that this font color green will be applied to H1, but the rule is it should be applied only to H1, not on other elements. So that is the one rule that we have to follow. Okay, so this is a syntax for using ID selector. So next type of selector that we are going to see is descendant selector. Okay, so what is difference between the class selector and ID selector? As I have explained, the one thing is like dot operator will be for class selector and hash symbol for the ID selector. Okay, so class selector can be applied on many elements, but ID selector can be applied on only one element. Okay, so this is how you will represent the class selector, and this is how you will represent the ID selector. Okay, so you will have the good understanding of the difference when you actually practice it. Okay, so next selector that we are going to see is descendant selector. Okay, so that is the parent and child construct. So specifying the rule to an element which is inside another element. Okay, so that is called descendant selector. So you can just look at this example where you're saying that the color is going to be green. So you can just translate. The color is going to be green. The font color is going to be green for the paragraph, where the paragraph should be inside the footer, not in other element. The paragraph should be inside the footer element. Okay, so that type of selector, so specifying the selector in a way that an element is there inside another element, so that is called descendant selector. Okay, so that is called descendant selector. So we have gone through all different types of selectors here. Okay, so class selector, ID selector, so normal HTML selector, class selector, ID selector, and descendant selector. Okay, so you will get better understanding on this when we actually practice it. So the next element that we are going to see, it is not a selector, but it is an HTML element that we will use it very often. So it's a HTML element. Span is the HTML element. Okay, so I'll explain. Span is the HTML element. I will specify the element span. So it is an inline element. Do you remember the inline and black level concept that we have discussed before? Inline means that in viewport it will just take the space what is needed, and black level will take the whole viewport. Okay, that is black level. So the inline element is span is the inline element. That means the style or something will be applicable only to that particular content which is wrapped up by the span element. Okay. So it starts with opening span tag and closes with ending span tag. So particularly this will be useful to format a particular content. For example, you can see, look at this example. In this paragraph, we want to make this Acme web design as a bigger font with bold character. Okay, so you cannot use the HTML selector P for this, right? You want to apply it only for this element. So in that case, what you can do, you can just wrap up this particular content, the Acme web design, inside this span element by opening tag and closing tag, where you can use the class selector. Okay, you can simply say class keyword and give a class name. Okay, then you want to change it font, right? So you want to make it bigger font. So in that case, you have to say class selector. How will you say class selector? Dot and then class name, company name, and then you can say font weight is bold and this font family, those kind of style distribution or style declaration you will specify inside this class selector. Okay, so this is something that will be useful when you want to apply a style only to a particular component of a web page. So this is about font span element. Okay, so in the next video we are going to see the order of precedence. We have seen different types of CSS, right? So we'll see order of precedence in the next